For more than a century, the story sounded settled. Billy the Kid was shot in 1881, buried in New Mexico. Case closed. Then one name kept coming back. John Miller, an Arizona man some people claimed was Billy living under a new identity. What makes this different from the usual Wild West rumor is that it didn't stay in old newspapers and campfire talk. It turned into a real-world DNA hunt with exhumations, courtroom fights, disputed evidence, and lab tests that were supposed to end the argument once and for all. This is the strange, modern collision between outlaw history and forensic science. John Miller versus history, and the Billy the Kid DNA battle. Number 1. Why DNA got pulled into a Wild West argument. When people say, just do a DNA test and settle it, they're assuming two things. First, that you have the right body, and second, that you have a clean, known sample to compare it to. The Billy the Kid debate is a perfect example of why those two things are hard in real life, especially in the American Old West, where records were spotty, graves moved, and legends spread faster than paperwork. The accepted story says Billy the Kid died in 1881 in Fort Sumner, New Mexico, shot by lawman Pat Garrett. The alternative story says Garrett shot the wrong man and Billy lived under another name. That's where John Miller enters the picture, because some researchers argued that a man buried in Arizona under that name could have been Billy living in disguise. Once that claim existed, DNA started sounding like the ultimate referee. Test John Miller, test any Billy evidence, and compare. But the moment you look at what they actually had to work with, old bones, questionable blood traces, missing official records, and legal hurdles, DNA turns from a simple test into a chain of decisions that can break at any link. Even mainstream coverage of the case described it as an expensive, messy effort. And one key problem kept coming up. The samples they compared didn't produce a useful match in the end. Number 2. What the official story actually claims happened in 1881. The mainstream account is straightforward on paper. Billy the Kid, also known as Henry McCarty and William H. Bonney, was a young outlaw tied to the Lincoln County War in New Mexico. After escapes and more trouble with lawmen, he ended up back near Fort Sumner, around the Maxwell Ranch. Pat Garrett, who had been pursuing him, wrote that he confronted Billy in a dark room at Pete Maxwell's place and shot him. A coroner's jury reportedly reviewed the death and ruled the killing a justifiable homicide, and Billy was buried soon after. Later writers and newspapers added layers to the story, some of it reliable, some of it sensational, but that core sequence is what most historians and public history sources still treat as the baseline. A big detail that matters for the DNA question is that territorial New Mexico didn't operate like a modern state government. Formal documentation practices were inconsistent, especially in rural areas, and a coroner's jury report could function as the key official recognition that a person had died. That gap between a report exists and a modern-style death certificate exists is one reason the debate never fully died. Number 3. The two problems that keep wrecking easy proof: paperwork and graves. If you're trying to prove identity after more than a century, you want clean documentation and a secure burial site. The Billy the Kid story doesn't offer either in a comfortable way. On the paperwork side, people arguing for an official modern confirmation kept running into the same point. New Mexico was still a territory in 1881, and death certificates weren't handled the way we think of them today, especially outside major population centers. That's why later efforts focused on the coroner's jury record and other contemporaneous documentation instead of a missing certificate. On the burial side, the problem is even more physical. The location of Billy's grave in Fort Sumner has long been tangled up with floods, moved markers, and uncertainty about the exact spot. A modern article on the topic lays out how grave markers were washed away and how later attempts to pinpoint the exact burial location didn't produce one definitive answer. That matters because the simplest DNA plan would be exhume Billy, exhume his mother, compare. If you can't reliably locate Billy's remains, that plan stalls immediately. Number 4. Who John Miller was and why his name became a target. John Miller matters here because he's one of the best-known "maybe it was him" alternatives to the Fort Sumner burial story. In one widely circulated version, he was a farmer and horse trainer who lived near the New Mexico-Arizona border and died in 1937. The claim isn't just he was in the right region, but also that he had knowledge of the Lincoln County War, spoke Spanish comfortably, and had personal traits that believers thought matched what people said about Billy. Some versions of the story even point to dramatic-sounding personal items, like a gun marked with notches, as if that could stand in for documentation. The key point, though, is practical. Unlike a disputed gravesite in Fort Sumner, John Miller had a known burial location in Arizona, in a cemetery connected to the Arizona Pioneers' home in Prescott. So for investigators trying to work the problem with the tools available, John Miller's grave looked like a place where you could actually obtain remains, run tests, and start eliminating possibilities, even if you still had to solve the bigger issue of what you were comparing those results to. Number 5. The investigators who pushed the case into the real world. This isn't just internet speculation. It turned into an official-style investigation with names, dates, and legal filings. Former Lincoln County Sheriff Tom Sullivan and Steve Saderwall, described in reporting as a former federal officer and also a mayor in New Mexico, were central figures in the early 2000s push to revisit whether Pat Garrett truly killed Billy the Kid. They explored the idea that Garrett shot someone else, and they pursued ways to use DNA to test competing claims, including the claim around Brushy Bill Roberts and the claim around John Miller. In early reporting around 2004, they were tied to efforts seeking to exhume the remains of Billy's mother, Catherine Antrim, in Silver City, New Mexico, with the idea that her DNA could be compared to a claimant's DNA. Those efforts ran into immediate resistance from local officials and ethical objections about disturbing graves, and the court process itself got complicated. Another report from that same period described a judge effectively putting up a procedural roadblock. The request to exhume Billy's mother was tied to whether there was permission and a viable plan to exhume Billy himself, and without that, the mother-first approach didn't move cleanly forward. In other words, the legal system was already shaping the science before a single lab result came back. Number 6. The bench DNA idea and why it's a forensic minefield. With exhumations blocked or uncertain, the investigation leaned into something that sounds dramatic but is scientifically fragile: extracting DNA from old blood traces linked by tradition and local story to Billy the Kid. Reporting and court documents describe investigators taking samples from a wooden bench said to be where Billy's body was placed after he was shot, then sending that material for DNA work. A legal filing in the public records dispute describes forensic expert Henry Lee examining the bench for DNA, and it describes the bench samples being sent to Orchid Cellmark for extraction and testing. Separate reporting also described physical scraping or taking splinters of wood from the bench as part of the effort. Here's the problem in plain language. Even if the bench really existed in the right place and time, you still have to prove the biological material is actually Billy's. In a busy Old West environment, lawmen, cowboys, soldiers, townspeople, visitors, objects get handled, cleaned, repaired, moved, and used again. DNA can also be mixed. Two people's genetic material can be on the same surface, and old samples degrade over time, especially with heat, moisture, and inconsistent storage. That means the lab might get a partial profile, a mixed profile, or a profile that can't be trusted as a single person's. And once the reference DNA is shaky, everything you compare to it becomes shaky too. Number 7. The Prescott exhumation and the legal gray zone. In May 2005, Sullivan and Saderwall went to Prescott, Arizona, and John Miller's grave was opened. Prosecutors later declined to pursue charges against the two men, saying it appeared officials in charge gave permission, and the men believed they had permission. That detail matters because it shows how close this came to becoming a criminal case rather than a historical debate. After remains were collected, the goal was to extract DNA from John Miller and compare it to the Billy DNA the investigators believed they had, mainly from the bench story. One Associated Press report described the comparison plan directly. Miller's DNA to blood traces taken from a bench believed to be the one used after the 1881 shooting. Another report added that the bones were returned and reinterred later that year.
The same reporting also captured the human side of the conflict. Saderwall refused to disclose the test results publicly at the time, saying he didn't want to provoke attacks from historians and insisting that what he believed differed from the accepted written history. Meanwhile, a court filing connected to later public records litigation describes something even more complicated. It says that, along with John Miller, remains from an adjacent grave, named William Hudspeth in the filing, were also part of the DNA matching effort, and it frames the entire operation as linked to an official-seeming case number investigation. Whether you accept those characterizations or not, the broader reality is clear. Once you start digging, you trigger government authority questions, permission questions, custody questions, and record-keeping questions that can become as important as the biology. Number 8. Why the DNA comparison didn't deliver a clean answer. The most important thing to understand is that, even with a lab involved and remains in hand, the end result can still be no usable conclusion. A major newspaper report about the overall effort stated that the lab results comparing the bench material and the John Miller material were essentially useless. That doesn't mean the lab was incompetent. It usually means one of several common outcomes in old case genetics. The sample didn't yield enough DNA markers to build a profile. The profile was too partial to compare confidently. The sample appeared mixed or contaminated, or the comparison couldn't reach a statistical threshold that a real forensic conclusion requires. This is exactly why professional forensic work insists on clear sourcing and chain of custody. If your Billy reference sample is uncertain, you might still get numbers and letters on a lab printout, but they won't answer the identity question in a way that would satisfy serious historians, courts, or scientists. Then there's the second obstacle. Even if you could build a profile, you still need the right kind of family comparison. Mitochondrial DNA, for example, follows the maternal line and can link someone to a maternal relative, but it's less uniquely identifying than a full autosomal profile. Y chromosome DNA follows the paternal line, but you'd need a reliable paternal line relative to compare it to. And for Billy the Kid, the family tree questions are exactly where myths and limited records create problems. Without clearly identified remains of Billy himself, or a securely verified close relative with a documented chain, the science ends up floating without an anchor. Number 9. How the DNA battle became a records war instead of a lab war. Once the public heard about a sheriff's investigation, a celebrity forensic scientist, a Dallas lab, and an exhumation, the next question was obvious. Where are the reports? That question triggered years of litigation in New Mexico under the state's Inspection of Public Records Act, often called IPRA. The case became closely associated with author and amateur historian Gail Cooper, and also a local newspaper, both seeking records connected to the Billy the Kid investigation and any DNA-related findings. An AP report later described Lincoln County paying significant attorney fees and settlement-related costs tied to the lawsuit, and it described Cooper specifically seeking records about Henry Lee's work and DNA testing connected to Billy the Kid claims. Another report described a court award of punitive damages in Cooper's favor at one stage and noted the broader taxpayer cost of the prolonged legal battle. Then, in a New Mexico Court of Appeals memorandum opinion filed in March 2016, the court explained that it was vacating the punitive damages and attorney fees portion, while affirming the district court on statutory damages issues, showing that even the legal wins were not simple or final.
This is the part many people miss. The fight wasn't only about whether Billy died in 1881. It was also about whether the investigation was public or private, whether officials acted in their official roles or as private citizens, who was responsible for records, and whether missing or withheld forensic documents violated public records law. Once that kind of dispute starts, it can outlast the science, because courts can keep going even when the lab results don't settle the headline question.
Number 10. Pardon politics, death certificates, and why the argument stays alive. The Billy the Kid identity debate doesn't live only in labs and cemeteries. It also lives in government decisions that shape what the public thinks counts as official. In 2010, New Mexico Governor Bill Richardson announced he would not issue a posthumous pardon connected to Billy the Kid, saying the evidence and history were too ambiguous to justify it. Coverage at the time noted that Richardson had considered the issue for years, and that the decision was influenced both by uncertainty about the historical bargain and by Billy's later actions. Years later, the official record issue surfaced again in a different form. Historian Robert Stahl pushed for the state to issue a death certificate for Billy the Kid as a way to cut through modern myths. Reporting around 2015 captured Stahl's argument that the lack of a death certificate didn't mean Billy didn't die. It reflected territorial-era practices, and the coroner's jury report was the key document. At the same time, popular media kept reigniting the dispute by presenting the survival scenario as plausible entertainment, which provoked pushback from many historians who saw the recycled claims as unsupported. Meanwhile, Fort Sumner's connection to Billy remains a major part of local tourism and public memory, with the town itself publicly describing the gravesite and even noting repeated theft and recovery of the marker in the past, to the point that the site is enclosed for protection. That mix, government reluctance to certify beyond doubt, legal fights over records, media retellings, and a physical gravesite that's both famous and historically complicated, keeps the John Miller versus history framing alive. The debate ends up being less about one dramatic shootout and more about what kinds of evidence people are willing to accept as final. A coroner's report, a court record, a lab printout, or a story that refuses to die.